This series of reflections has been about persons who were approached by God's grace and God's initiative and invited to change, invited to make a move in their lives, and who did. One of those is Esther, Queen of Persia. There's a whole book about her in the Old Testament. It's a wonderful story. I invite you to read it. Esther grew up in a troubled family. She was orphaned. Both of her parents died. And yet she somehow, by God's grace, was brought into the court of the king of Persia. Now, she didn't look for that. She didn't go after that. She didn't want that. She actually hid when they came looking for young women to take into the court of the king. But she was found. Once in the court of the king, it was her turn to spend a night with the king. Now keep in mind, she was a devout Jewish woman in a pagan court, the court of a pagan king. She did not want to be the king's concubine. And so whereas the rest of the young women were adorning themselves with marvelous fabric and scents, perfumes, she was very plain in her appearance, intentionally not wanting to attract any attention to herself. Well, guess who the king fell in love with and took her as his queen? You might think this is all a strange story until you realize God had a purpose. Everything that had happened in Esther's life had happened for a purpose, so that God could place her where He needed her when something dramatic was about to happen. And indeed it was. Esther, fine Jewish woman, had come to know another Jewish man in the court of the king. But she also learned through him that one of the king's most trusted advisors had a plot to kill all of the Jews. The king had no idea that she herself was Jewish. And so he had given permission to his advisor, go and do what you want, really not thinking through all the consequences. Well, now you know why God put Esther in the court of the king and made her the queen. She was an instrument of God's grace in saying to the king, your trusted advisor wants to kill all of my people. The king heard Esther, understood as he heard her what he had given permission for, and regretted that he had done so. He immediately withdrew his consent and ceased the destruction of all the Jewish people. God used Esther to bring about good, even though bad had happened to her early in life. She ended up in one place and then another, so that God could use her when the time came. You know, God thinks bigger than we do. God thinks a few steps ahead in life when we can't see that far. Someone recently said to me, Providence knows what we do not. Providence with a capital P, that is God. Providence knows what we do not. We see a little bit ahead. God sees the whole story. When God allows something bad to happen in our lives, it's often because He has a plan to redeem that with something good. The death of Jesus, the Son of God, was not the end of the mission and message of the gospel. The resurrection and ascension to heaven were the last words. When something bad happens to us, start looking for where God wants to bring good out of it, because that's often the case. And when God wants us to change, when God invites us and change happens to us, it's often because God thinks bigger than we do. Providence knows what we do not. And the best thing we can do is keep our ears and eyes open, waiting for the next step in God's love. God bless you.